So what would a foreign troop intervention in Gaza look like that abided by the
Yeah.
principles of the ceasefire? Like what
You mean from the Palestinian side, like
from
what
the
I've been
Palestinian
hearing from
perspective?
people?
Yeah.
I mean, look, I think that all Palestinians that I spoke to recognize that they're dealing with a very complicated reality with Trump's agenda, because you're dealing with an erratic person who views the US government at this moment as his private vessel to ensure that the Trump organization, his family businesses, his cronies are all set up long term. And that's part of how they got all of these Arab and Islamic countries on board, because there's business deals being made here. And so I think from the Palestinian perspective, even though there's a complicated history with UN peacekeeping forces, I think their belief was that the only way that the world could manifest its almost universal opposition to this genocide, its almost universal embrace of the idea of the cause of liberation of the Palestinian people, is to have troops that are on the ground, that come from a variety of nations, that are not linked to the genocidal forces of the Israeli entity, that are not under the direct control of Donald Trump, who's made clear that he is fully behind Israel in this. And that their belief was that this would have allowed a space where the Palestinian side would have some relative peace, an end to the acute genocide, to try to discuss how to establish a Palestinian state that would keep the occupied West Bank, occupied East Jerusalem, and Gaza as one entity. Because remember, as we reported, when the Palestinian side, quote unquote, accepted Trump's plan, that's not actually what they did. Even no matter what Trump says, no matter how he wants to talk about 3,000 years of history, Hamas and Islamic Jihad were empowered by the other Palestinian groups to negotiate a ceasefire, an exchange of captives, and terms for the resumption of delivery of life essentials into the Gaza Strip. All the other issues, they said, have to be discussed with a broader cross-section. Now, what's interesting is Trump's people are trying to get Arab states to agree to deploy troops as part of this force. And my understanding is none of them have come forward and said, oh yeah, we'd like to put our troops there. Why? Because you then have the prospect of not just these states doing nothing to stop Israel, but now they're going to be the agents operating at the behest of Israel and Trump to go and disarm Hamas, to disarm Islamic Jihad, to disarm the Palestinian people. Saudi Arabia and the UAE from the very beginning really wanted Israel to crush Hamas. Why? Because the existence of the armed resistance in Palestine is a pox on their houses.
Yeah.
Because all over the Arab world, oh, the Zionist entity. Oh, this state has an official policy. We're at war with the Zionist entity. Okay, you're at war. Have you done anything in that war? Are you going to do anything about the fact that they're burning children alive every day, that they're destroying mosques, that you have Israeli terrorists known as settlers that are running around burning the Quran, that they're raping prisoners, that nearly 100 Palestinians have been murdered inside of Israeli prisons since October 7th happened? Are you going to do anything about this? No. And so now what your action is on the ground is going to be to serve as the sort of death squads for the Israelis. None of these countries are saying, oh yeah, we're going to put our forces in there. So, Trump's talking to some non-Arab Islamic countries to try to see if they're willing to deploy forces. Egypt is training supposedly a quote unquote Palestinian police force. All of this really, though, I talk regularly to people from the Palestinian resistance, and my sincere sense was that they were interested in making concessions all the way to a point where they still felt that they could preserve the cause of self-determination. And at every turn, they had violence meted out against them, culminating with an attempt to murder the negotiating delegation on September 9th in a series of Israeli airstrikes in Doha, Qatar. So, the last thing I'll say about this, we are in the midst of one of the most epic lies in history. We are told that the Palestinian resistance is terrorism. If you study the history of self-determination, of anti-colonialism, of fights against apartheid, nothing about the Palestinian actions here falls outside of the scope of the types of actions we've seen in other causes of national liberation. You can debate tactics, we can talk about specific incidents, but if you look at the overarching framework, we are told to believe that these are terrorists, like some foreign body that has come into the region. These are the Palestinian people that are descendants of the Nakba. These are Palestinian people that have grown up knowing nothing but siege, starvation, war against them. So, I think part of the chains that are being broken right now in the world is that young people and free thinking people are recognizing the lies that have been told. This is one of the most legitimate causes, I think, just objectively speaking, one of the most legitimate causes of national liberation in the history of humanity. And so, these states have to ask themselves, which side are we going to be on? Up until now, by default or by action, they've been on the side of Israel.
So I still don't understand how they plan to execute this. So I guess so. You get some Indonesian troops, are they using life essentials again? As you said, they're tying life essentials to the
I,
execution of this. And
I suspect we're going to see private contractors start to become a major point of discussion. To be honest, Ryan, this is also kind of what happened in U.S. wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Trump, I think, is reluctant to deploy a large number of U.S. boots on the ground. Yes, you have roughly 200 Americans that are on the ground right now in this sort of quote unquote unified command center that is overseeing what's happening in Gaza right now. But I don't think Trump's going to want to stick American boots on the ground in any large format. He could change his mind on that. So I think there will be some states certainly to try to win favor with Trump that are going to be willing to offer up some troops. But my guess is that you're going to have a very large tail, as they call it in military terminology, of private contractors that if they want to implement this, they're going to have to necessarily deploy. And so you could have a situation where former U.S. military, former special operations guys from the United States are deployed as part of this force, or British, or German, or what have you. That's the model that's been in existence for a while. But I think Arab and Islamic countries are very, very nervous about deploying their people, particularly if the primary mission is demilitarization of a just liberation cause.
Well, Colombia's Petro has talked about sending, international troops there, but we may end up getting Colombians in there actually.
That's what we're seeing in Sudan and right. Elsewhere. And, I wonder also, Eric Prince, the founder of Blackwater, it's going to be interesting to see if he comes back into play here. He's very close to Jared Kushner. He's close to some of Trump's sons. In the first Trump administration, he was constantly coming in and out of meetings at the White House discussing his various plans for how private forces could be used around the world. But on this Colombia issue, I met with the senior advisor to President Petro of Colombia last week, and the senior advisor on Palestine, and was asking him about this Uniting for Peace resolution. What is a Uniting for Peace resolution? It means that if the UN Security Council, if a member of the UN Security Council is blocking action that would be necessary to, for example, confront a genocide, the United Nations General Assembly can circumvent the UN Security Council and deploy a force. And this wouldn't be a force that's going to go to war against Israel. It's effectively it would be a force that would put itself between the aggressor and the victims, between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And this was gaining some momentum, I was told. But then when this Trump plan started to gain more momentum, and you saw the endorsement of the plan coming from Arab and Islamic countries, and then the key to it was that you get Abbas because he has this card that says, "Oh, I'm the one that speaks for the Palestinians," even though his popularity is 10% right now. Once that happened, the Colombians said, "Okay, we're going to pull back on this, watch how this unfolds." They're saying that they're not dropping the idea of a Uniting for Peace resolution, but they've essentially put it on a form of pause right now. I think that's been disappointing to a lot of people who felt that, this would have been an opportunity, a historic opportunity for the UN General Assembly to confront the fact that the U.S. was vetoing all of these ceasefire resolutions. But, now it's a complicated situation. The UN, with Russia and China stepping aside, Russia and China allowed an unprecedented thing to happen, which is the UN endorsing a foreign military force to deploy in historic Palestine that will be under the command of a man named Donald Trump. This is, again, I keep reiterating it. It's mind-blowing what's happened here.
Last question for you. What do you understand about the conditions inside Gaza now? There's been a lot of good reporting about the way that Israel is withholding essentials such as tents, stakes, like any types of equipment needed to rebuild. We've seen flooding and really difficult weather lately. We're now getting into another cold season, and that's aside from the the problems that so many people were having with malnutrition. What are you hearing about what the reduction in bombing, because not a cessation of it, but at least a reduction of bombing and the allowing in of some life essentials. What has that done for conditions?
One fact that a senior Hamas official told me over the weekend, who sort of is dealing with helping to coordinate, because Hamas remains the governing authority there, so they have access to statistics and what's happening on the ground, because their people as civil servants are involved with this, said that there was supposed to be 600 trucks per day that are entering Gaza, and at times, on some days, you do have hundreds of trucks that have come in. But what he said is that when we've audited what has come in many cases, 2/3 or more of what has been delivered is for commercial purposes, which means that Palestinians can be, it goes to businesses, which means that, Palestinians can then be subjected to having to pay enormously high prices just to get basic life essentials. That's not an accident, it's by design. So it's still reinforcing this Hunger Games atmosphere to try to keep the Palestinians desperate. We shouldn't even use the term humanitarian aid. Israel, under international law, remains the occupying power. They're not giving aid to the Palestinians when trucks come in. We're talking about bare essentials. We're talking about life essentials. So, I think that, yes, it's true that the massive scorched earth bombing has ended. You have Israel still doing military strikes. You still have Israeli forces shooting and killing Palestinians, but in a far reduced state. But the generalized state of siege still exists. And now what the UN has done has been to put before the Palestinian people essentially a threat that is rooted in 77 years of war of annihilation, which is, if you don't bend the knee, if you don't accept apartheid and subjugation, the only option we're leaving you is armed resistance. So, if the aim is to end armed resistance in Palestine, there's a clear path to that.
Right.
Establish a Palestinian state. Allow the Palestinians to have an army capable of defending itself. Address the fact that Israel has hundreds of nuclear weapons. Address the fact that no one talks about disarming Israel. This is the biggest state terrorist in the region, and they're being treated as though they have the mandate to be running around with an international force, disarming the people that they're committing genocide against. That's why the Palestinians rightly say this is an attempt to win for Israel through this cajoled blackmail agreement that the UN has now rubber stamped, what they never have been able to achieve through force, which is murdering every single Palestinian or forcing them into fourth-class residency in a territory that's made up of tiny little cantons that are administered by collaborators masquerading as Palestinian officials.
Yeah. All right. Well, Jeremy, thank you for the update. Really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, Ryan.